Thanks, Kiande, and thanks to all of our presenters from the test case sessions. It has been really great to see the diversity of the applications that real-world data can have to help advance device evaluation, both to support patient safety and to help drive forward innovation. And that brings us to our final session, which is focused on digital technologies and the evolution and innovation of devices and how technology and real-world evidence really encourage innovation within this ecosystem. NEST has undertaken test cases focused on digital technologies in the pre-market space. And many of you know, we are also building out a cloud infrastructure for active surveillance in the post-market to harness, again, digital technologies. And across this entire continuum are opportunities and challenges that our speakers for this session are really taking the lead on. I'm looking forward to a great discussion to close out our program today, touching both on real-world experience and forward-thinking approaches for real-world evidence. So thanks for hanging in there with us, and Remy's thanking you too. So I'm going to do brief introductions for our 4-session panelists, and afterwards I'll ask them to join me here on the virtual stage. So I'll go in alphabetical order. David Feygin, he is the Chief Digital Health Officer and Vice President of IT Digital Health and Data Solutions at Boston Scientific. He leads Boston Scientific's Digital Health and Data Solutions strategy and chairs the Cross-Functional Digital Health Council and Digital Accelerator and Growth Board. He is also a member of the NEST governing committee. Next, we have Fred Resnick, and Fred is chairman of the Division of Cardiovascular Medicine at Lahey Hospital and Medical Center, as well as professor at Tufts University School of Medicine. He is an active clinical interventional cardiologist participating in the development and evaluation of numerous devices used in a variety of cardiac conditions. He's also an expert researcher, stellar network collaborator from the NEST Research Network, and he's also really been helping lead our active surveillance efforts. David Rhew is the Global Chief Medical Officer and Vice President of Healthcare at Microsoft. He is the chairman of the Health and Fitness Technology Division for the Consumer Technology Association, and he serves on CTA's Board of Industry Leaders. He's also an adjunct professor at Stanford University School of Medicine. And David is also a member of the NEST governing committee. And last but not least is Annie Saha. She is the Assistant Director of Digital Health Center of Excellence within FDA CDRH, leading the development of partnerships, regulatory science, strategic planning, and operations to really empower digital health stakeholders and advancing healthcare. Annie was previously the Director of Partnerships to Advance Innovation and Regulatory Science, or PAIRS, where she really oversaw a broad program portfolio supporting a number of strategic partnerships and regulatory science programs for CDRH. So as our panelists are joining me on video, I'm going to mute and go off cam for 2 seconds to take away the squeaky toy. Love live sessions. All right. So hopefully I brought a little levity to the end of the day loveliness. So let me start with David Rhew. And by the way, I'm going to direct some questions during our panel discussion to individual folks, but I know this panel, you're not shy. Jump in. And I don't think we put enough time for this closing session. But David Rhew. So digital devices and technological innovations, they've really shaped health for the better. But interoperability really becomes kind of that key piece to unlocking their true potential. Even in opening session, we touched on digital health and digital health tools and the fact that it might be the wild, wild west out there, right? So from your perspective, how can we work on interoperability of systems and the development of standards as all of this technology is evolving?
Thanks, Sandy, and a real pleasure to be here. Well, if you've ever tried to gain access to your medical record, you know how difficult it can be. And it really is a question of both technology and policy. And what we have seen is that from a technology perspective, understanding how to create multiple levels of interoperability and then defining and agreeing upon those standards and continue to advance them as we find newer devices and different ways for us to be able to bring different data sets together requires a lot of collaboration and coordination. And what we're starting to see is a significant movement towards centralized or standards that allow us to be able to communicate more effectively and allow us to understand also the semantics behind what the terms mean. The policy piece has also advanced, and we have seen, starting with the 21st Century Cures Act and now with the CMS interoperability rules, an opportunity for us to be able to see how electronic health record data, payer claims data sets can all be brought in using open APIs and FHIR standards to a common platform. And we're also seeing, in addition to the ability to do it, but also the blocking rules that have been enforced or have been applied, which prevent organizations from essentially preventing individuals from being able to gain access to this. So those two things in combination have created a new environment. That new environment allows us to start thinking about how we can pull different data sets together, normalize the information, and apply artificial intelligence on top of it. This is different. This is not something we could have done 5-10 years ago. And it creates a brand new environment for how we can rethink how the technologies can be used to become much more proactive and allow us to be able to improve health outcomes.
So along those similar lines, though, David Feygin, like we have seen not just the increased use of digital tools, right, but really that shift to bringing, what we've coined or has been coined kind of consumer speed to healthcare, right? So we're talking about telehealth, we're doing remote monitoring, we're using personal health trackers, and with COVID and the pandemic, all of this has only been accelerated to where feels like it's almost we're in the tele-first kind of environment. Kind of touch on the manufacturer's perspective here, from going from that traditional to moving more towards the digital, I'll use an old term, a digital age, or even, software as a medical device as we're moving through there.
Yeah, it's thank you. And pleasure to be here. Thrilled to support Nest and help with this journey. I think that we're all just incredibly excited about. Tele first, tele preferred for those who haven't really worn long pants for a long time because they're working from home at their desks. I think there really is this preference a lot of the time for telecare in many ways. And what you talk about is really the holy grail, right? How do we bring this consumer speed innovation and iteration into the healthcare space? And you can imagine it's going to be hard to get full consumer tech speed because there is risk, there is harm, and doing potential harm at digital scale and with digital speed is scary. So you need those controls that we've had, but we are making tremendous progress. Many manufacturers are moving from these 3 to 5 year medical device development cycles down to monthly or even bi-weekly releases of software-based features or functionality. And that really requires a full-on transformation of how we're structured and how we do work. But the exciting thing is I think we're doing it, right? We're bringing many of these consumer rapid innovation principles into the healthcare space. That's what really digital health is. And even into, as you said, into the software as a medical device space. So how are we doing it, right? We're using principles of agile, lean startup iterations, right? These ideas of minimally viable products, doing a little bit and getting it out the door. User-centered design is absolutely critical. And all the while building in quality and compliance. That's where the safety piece comes in, right? Having the software be automated and even check itself. I think one of the key unblockers here that we really have to get out the door as an industry is what the FDA is doing with their digital health pre-cert program. Without that lever, without the ability to both be transparent with the FDA and also get pre-certified to deliver features and functionality in an iterative way, we're never going to get quite there. But I think the FDA is just making tremendous progress on that, and I think that's just going to be a huge lever, and we should all push for it. Which really brings us to the final question, or this integrating point of data, right? So what is the impact of this tele-first care? Obviously, it's care access. There's a lot of benefits. But the really exciting thing is now that these interactions aren't just person to person or patient to physician in a room where nobody hears it, they're actually mediated by computers. So every one of these tele interactions actually creates incredibly valuable data that we've really never had in healthcare before, right? It's specific, it's related to the patient, it's contextual, it's really the type of data that needs to be used, that the AIs and really all algorithms are looking for to drive care automation and efficiency and iteration. So I think we're really on the cusp of an incredible wave of data leverage across healthcare like we haven't seen it before, because of this really tele everything reality. And I think it's this iteration, this learning that's and really experimentation, but safe experimentation, that's going to enable us to bring this consumer quality and consumer speed innovation into the med tech world.
So I can't help myself, because David, you touched on pre-cert, that Annie, I'm coming to you on, the Digital Center of Excellence and the core initiatives that you have, and helping to guide kind of that future of digital, including pre-certification programs. We also talked about AI and ML and software as a medical device. Can you touch on some initiatives here and how we're guiding that? Because there's so much out there.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for having me. And I'm looking forward to this panel and already the great discussion we've heard so far. And so I think Sammy and actually both Davids have sort of weaved together some of those threads of there's so much happening in the digital health space. And that's really why we launched our Digital Health Center of Excellence, actually nearly, or it might be exactly a year ago, at this point, to really empower stakeholders. And then how do we really create that coordination functions where we can really bring people together to really focus on these challenge areas? And, if you think about it, there's software as a medical device that might be sort of the big umbrella term, and then AI ML is sort of one subset that has a lot of similar characteristics or opportunities as a type of software as a medical device, but with its own sort of challenges and efforts. And so we're sort of ensuring both internally and as we partner externally, how do we build those pieces together along with our efforts with the pre-certification program, as well as collaborating internally with our folks in our Office of Clinical Evidence and Analysis, especially on the real-world performance aspects, and understanding how we can leverage lessons learned through the NEST test cases and other activities in other sort of the traditional device space, but focused in the digital health space. And that's one area, certainly, that's a high important part of our efforts with the pre-cert program. David Feygin talked a little bit about some of that and really how we're trying to, determine and assess sort of the cluster and quality of a particular company so we can ensure that there's a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness as these technologies are evolving over time. One of the pieces that we have to continue to look at is that as we continue to explore and promulgate a lot of the key concepts with the pre-cert program, pilot program, and these approaches that, there might be some needs for some new regulatory frameworks to really fully implement this tailored approach. And, we're going to continue to work on our end to advance those tools and policies to ensure that we're, promoting efficiency and effectiveness and oversight, as well as ensuring that we're promoting health equity. And our efforts both through the pre-cert program and then the efforts that we have with our AIML activities through the action plan that we put out in January that has really 5 pillars, one of which is focused on thinking about pilots and real world performance, but other areas that are also incredibly important are to be thinking about some of the regulatory science methods, especially understanding bias, ensuring the diversity, the transparency of the data that's coming from these algorithms, and what does that look like and what does that mean? And we're hosting a workshop specifically on that topic on October 14th, as well as thinking about it from a patient-centered perspective of understanding what's important, whether you're a patient or a provider, to understand both for AIML technologies, but again, how that generalizes more broadly to software as a medical device, and how we can really think about how we work together collaboratively to ensure that we're collecting that data that's needed to understand that, of course, the devices are safe and effective, they're going to improve health outcomes, and how do we do that in an efficient way while not compromising safety and effectiveness.
That was a lot there. And so my head spins every time we talk about digital technologies, digital health tools, it gets a little maddening, and, no wonder we think it's the wild, wild west, because there's just so much to it, right? But you touched on something, Annie, from a patient and provider perspective, which, Fred, from your perspective as a provider, as a researcher, clinician, a partner for our active surveillance initiatives, like, how can we leverage this technology to make the data more meaningful to improve outcomes for patients? Because I think in one of these earlier sessions, we had talked about, because there's so much data out there, some of it is noise, right? And so how can we use it more meaningfully, and, how can AIML benefit the devices themselves? Sorry, go ahead.
No. So I think, I wear 2 really different hats, and I think everyone wears lots of hats. So, the clinician side, I think, I'll start with the researcher side and the participation in all the, or many of the spectacular initiatives that NEST and FDA have been sort of, pushing forward over the last several years to really come up to sort of the 21st century and forward-looking in terms of medical device total product life cycle support in some ways, and how we can use data that's meaningful for regulators, helpful for clinicians, helpful for patients, and helpful for industry to move at this now, consumer speed that David Feygin was mentioning. So I think there's a lot of tremendous opportunity with the sort of rapid accumulation and availability of data that's available from EHR claims, from the devices themselves. And, I look at that from the research side as ways of extending the meaningful utility of data, regardless of the method, whether it's AI, ML. So I'm just saying, like, the data is, how does that help us with the real shortcomings that we have when we think about weaving current data of sources and collaborators together? We have great trouble connecting data sets. We heard in the last session about even those centers that, or organizations that are using exactly the same common data model with the exact same sort of algorithms have inconsistencies because of sort of data integrity and quality at the very, very granular level. So figuring out how we can really link these data sources together in a robust manner, thinking about how that helps us in some way get to resolve this issue of device identification, which we know we have strategies for, and FDA and has been such an initiating force on UDI. But getting to longitudinal outcomes is such a challenge from the health system perspective, right? And then and is even limited on the claim side based on who's enrolled where over what time and what the policies are. It's a very dense jungle of navigating, but the opportunity is enormous. So I think we have to keep working with the policy changes that David Rhew was mentioning that are opening up this sort of opportunities to make better connections and interoperability between the various data sources. And so there's enormous opportunities on that side of empowering sort of digital data revolution for medical device total product lifecycle support. And whether it's from the industry side, patient side, physician side, regulator side, there's value. There's value to everybody. And so I think we're all going to be aligned to try to move it forward really effectively and try to keep up with the digital sort of pace of life. But I have to say, from the provider side, it's a nightmare. So you can imagine as you interact with your own healthcare providers for you and your family, this is really not easy. And so patients are bringing personal health information, tracker information, which may be accurate, may have limitations, may be noise at that source level, creating sort of anxieties for the patients. There's this sort of tidal wave of hidden digital data. We could think about like pacemakers and ICDs. There's simply no way to intelligently consume the enormous tidal wave of information that is hitting providers, and that patients somehow have an expectation that people should understand how it all comes together, but it really doesn't yet. And so even just the mechanisms of ingesting discrete data is not really resolved to the clinical delivery environment yet. And I think, as a society, it's the digital health revolution is racing on ahead on a very fast horse. But back in the background is the actual infrastructure of healthcare. And the actual infrastructure of healthcare, is just getting over paper-based communication, right? Like we're 50 years behind industry. And there's a huge tension there, and I'm afraid that like silly putty, it's just spreading apart from what's capable, what technology is able to provide in terms of collecting more and more rapid, real-time information about patients' health and even surrogates for patient-reported outcomes. There's spectacular papers regarding how one can measure the effectiveness of heart failure interventions by looking at Fitbit information. If patients are moving more, they're less heart failure, right? So, so I think we have these two important horizons that we have to sort of keep in mind, and letting our enthusiasm for the digital health innovation move so fast forward is going to help us in the integration side, but is going to challenge us on the healthcare delivery side.
And so that's an interesting concept that I would like to get both David, since they come from industry, and we were talking, and there is a difference between providers and the healthcare delivery system versus what industry is accomplishing. And let me just pause. I'd love to hear from the two of you. I'm surprised you haven't jumped in yet.
Well, I'm trying. I think we're both ready.
Yeah. David, why don't you go first? I'll jump
Sure.
in second.
Look, Fred is spot on, right? Technology that we've introduced over the last really even 3-4 decades on the digital side, and every time we introduce it, there's a reason, right? We improve outcomes, we improve efficiency, but the technology we've introduced to date is the problem. It has created this incredible data deluge where it is ridiculous how much we expect of physicians and how much patients expect the physicians to synthesize. Now, technology got us into this mess, but I also believe technology is going to get us out of this mess. And that's really what you're starting to see, right? The presence of the AIs building on the smarter data, highlighting the visual AI space of imaging is already accelerating tremendously, and you know, in some cases, really helping drive efficiency and give physicians their lives back. I mean, this is very much top of mind for us because the physicians are our customers, right? If we're creating solutions that make their lives terrible, that's not a good place for us to be. I will say that, you know, healthcare has never been technology averse. When you look across healthcare, I mean, it is we leverage absolutely every bit of technology we can, which creates incredible fragmentation to create that improved outcome. But I think that the challenge here is really that sometimes we've had digital solutions that haven't correlated to those improvements in either efficiency or outcomes. And that's where you kind of get back to data, and honestly where you get back to Nest, right? Imagine if Nest is able to provide that, not just real world evidence and real world data, but that real time real world data that can help you understand the impact, and that can help you not just, you know, spot safety signals, very important, but can actually help you inform how your offerings and how your digital offerings are doing and how they're being consumed and how much, you know, even angst they're causing either the physician or the patient. I mean, that's really the world where we're getting into, where technology, yes, created that problem, but technology can also solve that day-to-day loose problem.
If you go back in time and you take a look at what got us into this mess, and I'll start with meaningful use. Well-intentioned, you know, clearly driving towards the right objective of digitizing healthcare, but the technology always needs to be accompanied by forward-thinking policy. And one of the things that we didn't quite anticipate would happen, but now in retrospect, it was pretty obvious it would, is that when you empower everyone to build technology and go live and create systems, they create it in their own way, their own proprietary systems. They work well, interoperable completely within the system, but they don't communicate with the competitors. And when you've got a whole bunch of competitors out there, everyone's got their own system. And now what we've been trying to do is we've been trying to force these technologies, which are now mature and really hardened into our own clinical workflows and research initiatives, to now start talking together. It's harder when you do it later on. And so what we're now at is another pivotal point in technology, because a lot of data that we're talking about is data that comes outside of electronic health records from devices and other parts. So the opportunity for us is to start thinking about the lessons learned from meaningful use and start understanding that interoperability needs to be defined, and the path forward has to be defined so that everyone follows the same standard. And I'll give you a couple of examples of things that are underway that I think will allow us to be able to get to that. A couple of years ago, the cloud industry leaders got together during the Blue Button 2.0 conference and made a commitment, a pledge to interoperability in the use of FHIR. That was specific for healthcare, and it was specific for allowing us to be able to share data. And we compete against each other. So it's not because of anything apart from recognizing that the greater value is when everyone works together, open APIs, shareable information, using open standards, using common standards. And CMS and with the ONC movement towards FHIR, we now have a foundation for how we can build off of that. And so what I think we have now is an opportunity for us to embrace these standards. And even though we may want to be tempted to solve the problem as quick as possible using whatever way, we have to always come back to the greater good. And I think that the role for Nest and organizations like Nest that have an advisory capacity to the organizations is that we have to always keep that in mind as we start building processes and approving that we're looking to build it towards ways that allow and foster open collaboration, innovation, and also apply the standards that we have in place.
I feel, Annie, like I've left you out, so I'm going to give you the opportunity, but you know I have more questions for you specifically.
I'm sure. Well, I have to say I agree with from Fred and both Davids in terms of when you're talking about the data side, what do we do with all this data from the technology? So whether you're a physician, patient, or even us as FDA, from a least burdensome perspective across the board, how do we determine when do we make actionable decisions based on the data we're getting from a digital health technology, whether you're talking about a wearable, a sensor-based technology, the AI, ML-enabled device, what do we do with that? How can we, collaboratively work together in terms of determining what are those standards or the other types of activities or things that we need to do to think about how do we actually make that information actionable and usable, whether it's a patient and a provider in a one-on-one conversation, a patient on their own, whether it's industry, whether it's FDA, and what does that really look like? And that's where an opportunity for NEST and other organizations can really potentially play a part to help us bring everyone together rather than trying to solve everything on our own for our own, specific use and context. So, David Rhew, your point in speaking about interoperability and data access. And certainly on the interoperability side, that's something, we're thinking about as FDA has one piece of that puzzle, but we really need to be thinking more globally and more broadly across federal agencies, across different, both the device industry, the tech industry, across the board of how do we create that ability for people while still allowing for, of course, proprietary information and for people to, have their business interests also met, but also ultimately that public good of being able to bring together that information that's actionable to whoever that stakeholder is and in a way that is going to be useful and that we're not creating more problems for ourselves down the pike. And so I think I like, David, your point, Rhew, your point of sort of thinking about that greater good and not just trying to run to a solution, but let's really be thoughtful about what that solution looks like so that we're not just putting a Band-Aid on something that's going to start bleeding later. That was a bad analogy,
but and I think there's so many lessons, like important lessons to learn from meaningful use, specifically for NEST, because I absolutely agree with David Rhew that there is a pre-competitive component where there's pure waste, right? Not aligning to data standard is pure waste. On the other hand, I think one of the main challenges with meaningful use was that it actually prescribed the solution. And it many cases, it eliminated the process of this value-guided experimentation, right? Because we just assumed we knew the answer. Hey, go digitize and structure everything in this way, and that simply was not the case. So when you think about policy, how do you, where do you draw the line? How do you eliminate the waste? But there's no question that you need experimentation, iteration, and competition, and drawing. I think in some ways, meaningful use, drew that line in an incorrect place, or not incorrect. Not that I had the answer, right? But maybe suboptimal, at least in retrospect.
And we've talked about interoperability, the need for alignment. What other kinds of opportunities do you see, or areas where we may need to diverge instead of align? When we're talking about specifically digital device regulation and digital health tools that might be used in research. I threw in an audience question in there because it was down the path of our line of thinking.
Well, Sandy, I wanted to follow up on a point that Fred brought up, because I think that this ties into what you're describing here. Part of the problem is interoperability, but that just gets us to having to deal with the second problem, which is there's just a lot of data out there. And a lot of that data is not very helpful from a clinical or research perspective. If someone were to send me a whole database of all the steps they took, or all the blood pressure readings, I'm not really sure what I can make of that. First of all, I'd spend a lot of time looking through it, and I just don't think that really provides that meaningful data. What I really care about is this person worsening? Is their condition worsening? Is there something that I need to act on? And when you think about like how humans interpret that, it's not based on one or even just multiple sets of that same type of data. It's about combinations of data. It's about understanding in the context of a particular individual, with a certain set of vulnerabilities and comorbidities, whether or not certain parameters and changes in those parameters are happening. And this ties into the next concept of how artificial intelligence and machine learning are a critical part of how digital health will advance. Because if it boils down to just capturing as much data and presenting it back to the clinicians, we're never going to make any sense of it. It doesn't really have value. What we want is either somebody or a computer to do it. Now, computers are far more efficient and scalable. So it's computers that are really going to allow us to be able to get to that next point. And that's where we need to then start thinking about how AI gets regulated, the software as a medical device, the things that Annie and the FDA are working on, because that really is the next generation for how digital health becomes usable by the clinicians. But right now, we're just taking baby steps. We're just starting to be able to figure out how to transfer information and do it in a way that is seamless for both the consumer and the researcher and the clinician side. But once we get to that point of having it all brought in, and then having the interoperability, so data sets such as electronic health record, claims data sets, genomics, and others can be allow for personalized recommendations. Using AI, we should be able to get to better health outcomes.
And what David mentioned, searching through this data, and we often talk about big data. And there's almost this assumption that, hey, if you have enough data, you're going to be able to answer the question you're asking. But that's sort of silly, right? You might have a terabyte of data about I don't know, the geographic landscape or whatever that might have nothing to do with the thing you're looking for. So I think there's this idea of this critical bit, right? Sometimes so much of healthcare is one bit, right? It's one digital diagnostic that says yes or no, that defines how you care for a patient, basically. And so I think there will always be this connection between the digital and the data and the medical device and the sensor, right? Because very often you're better off solving the problem by creating a sensor that actually generates that critical bit than doing all the AI. And I do think we're in this world where we have to connect the dots, right? Between the digital and the data and the device and the sensor and the physiology and so forth, because that's where the real value, that's where the solutions are going to lie. And I think that's complicated. And I think that's why you're hearing so many people talk about interfaces and interoperability and even, speaking different languages and trying to harmonize. And I think, to the extent that Nest can help us create that kind of common language almost to even discuss these things, I think that'd be incredibly useful.
So
I think that's a point, or one other, sorry, Sandy, just one other point too along those lines is it the right, you might just get all this, terabyte of data, as David just said, but is it the right data? Are we creating, unintentional or biases? Are we leaving people behind? The whole looking at from a health equity perspective, a diversity perspective. Are we losing underrepresented or other populations when we are talking about all this data and information? So that's another thing we really need to make sure that we are sort of keeping at the front of mind as we're thinking about these AI and other types of digital health technologies.
So as we think about this, and we're talking about big data, there's a lot of data, and a lot of it contributes noise. That's really, that's kind of my oversimplification. But we open the session talking about interoperability, but diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we talked about it in a slightly different sense based on the diversity of our test cases, but taking that down to a patient level, when we talk about DEI, how can digital tools or technologies help us in this area and really start to make a difference? Because I know one of the initiatives within Nest is we are really trying to get not just partner with collaborators that may have access to a lot of data and are in large cities, but how do we get the rest of the population to get that snapshot and really harness the real world in real world data?
So, I mean, you can imagine sort of not too distant future where we really have such robust wearable personal technology. I mean, our phones have evolved unbelievably in 10 years. And I think, can we be collecting patient level information in a equitable manner? And we have to be really cautious. We know that there are, we saw it with COVID and education and entire regions of the country, rural school districts that don't have broadband, and going remote becomes really challenging. So we have to be very conscious of it, right? I mean, I think that's from a policy point of view that David Rhew started out at the beginning, saying that we're doing maybe a more thoughtful job with policy around giving patients the tools, even if they may not recognize them today, to start being able to access their information in a more democratic manner. But we still have larger society inequities that we're going to have to wrestle with to assure that the healthcare innovations that David Feygin's company is coming up with actually benefits as many people as it sort of ought to. And maybe that gets back more to the collective view that David Rhew was talking about earlier. Is some of these innovations have to keep in mind that the health of the community is sort of, especially today, we realize how much the health of the community impacts the health of the individual. I would, so I was an electrical and computer engineer before going into medicine. So I think of this revolution today as so exciting and so incredible. And I so hope that David and David are correct, that we can get to a point where software systems are able to help us filter the deluge of data that's generated by now smart devices all around us and with our patients, so that the clinicians are more in the realm of applying knowledge rather than trying to sort of elicit it from the equivalent of what is a stack of PDFs and just now electronically on your computer. I mean, so it's a great moment to be in the technology and medical device world like David and David are, because we see that there is this immediate opportunity ahead of us. The patients want it, right? Patients want digitally enabled healthcare, especially younger patients. But even my 95-year-old patients want to do telehealth on a regular basis because they don't want to drive in traffic on a regular. So there's such an opportunity, but it is going to take some coordination. And like everyone's saying, Nest has a major seat at the coordination table.
So on that note, we are at time. So thank you. I didn't even pay you, Fred, for that. Ending on a Nest note. Thank you. This was seriously a fantastic and engaged panel. Goose and Remy were thrilled to be part of it too, squeaking their way along. I had fun, and as I said, we could talk a really long time about digital health and digital health tools and technologies. So really, thank you, everyone, for your participation. So this has been a super program, tremendous insights into real world evidence. I want to thank all of our presenters, panelists, you, our attendees, our stakeholders, and really the Nest community. We are a cute community, and I can't help myself, #NestRocks. As always, we welcome and really appreciate your thoughts and feedback. Please complete our survey when you close out of the event. As a reminder, recordings will be available on the website and emailed to participants in the coming days. And then as we continue to complete our test cases, we will be hosting additional forums to share insights for really more of that real world experience with real world evidence. So we really hope you'll join us next time. Have a wonderful evening.